The Sunday in question started like any other. I stuck the ribs on the fire early on, arranged the log benches around them, beer in the styrofoam, and even a little accordion rehearsal that my brother-in-law insisted was music. The meat was roasting slowly, the smell spreading through the air like a sacred invitation, and the dogs were already positioning themselves near the grill, with that pleading look that only mongrels know how to give. And then she came. From a distance, you could already see the shadow of her standing on the clay road, walking determinedly as if she were the sheriff of the food apocalypse. She was wearing white dress pants and a fancy beige blouse, and had clearly never seen a hoe in her life. Around her neck was a leather chain with a soybean pendant. I kid you not. And at the waist, well, that was the icing on the cake. A makeshift holster with a gun that looked so clumsy, but that no one had the courage to doubt. She drove through the gate without asking permission, completely ignoring the strip of barbed wire that separated my driveway from the main road. She arrived huffing and puffing, her forehead wrinkled as if she were about to unleash a presidential decree. Without even saying hello, he marched straight over to the barbecue, pointed at the rotating meat, and said in the most theatrical voice I've ever heard, "This is ritualistic murder. I'm closing it now." I froze for half a second, not because of what she said, but because who in their right mind invades a farm with a gun to talk about tofu? The irony is that, in the middle of the shack, the song playing on the radio was Zay Ramalho talking about the apocalypse, which gave the whole scene a prophetic touch. She started shouting that the HOA had approved a new guideline, prohibition of meat consumption and preparation within the visual limits of the community. Visual boundaries. I didn't even know that was a legally recognized unit of measurement. The people around me started to stand up, at first thinking it was a joke, but the problem was that she spoke with such conviction that I was afraid to contradict her. My aunt, who already had a plate of sausages in her hand, stopped in mid-air, frozen as if the sausage had become criminal evidence. My father-in-law, a stubborn old man who has never bowed his head to anyone, took a step forward, but I motioned with my hand for him to stop. I wanted to understand how far this was going. The woman took a crumpled piece of paper out of her pocket, with the HOA crest printed in black and white, and a few sentences underlined with green highlighter. She threw it on the table as if it were a court order. When I picked it up, I almost laughed. It read something like, "Notification of food practices that are aggressive to the environmental values of the rural condominium." Signed by herself, of course. No stamp, no validity, no sense of reality. But for her, that was enough to cancel a barbecue. And she thought she had the right to do it with a revolver on her hip. That's when I realized that the game was different. She wasn't just a hysterical invader trying to be the hero of the planet. This was someone desperate to prove that she was in control, even if it was over a bleeding steak. Gradually, the guests moved away, some still holding their glasses, others just watching with a look that mixed astonishment with shame. The poor dog barked and hid under the bench. She started threatening to call the community environmental force, whatever that was, and demanded that I put out the fire immediately. And that's when I realized that woman wasn't going to stop. It didn't matter if I showed her that she had no authority, that the paper was a joke, or that we were on private property. She wanted a war. She wanted to impose a lifestyle that only existed in her head. But she forgot that here, the bush isn't just a decoration, and that we learned from an early age that fire is fought with intelligence, not hysteria. And at that moment, I decided that I wasn't just going to defend my barbecue. In that instant, when she screamed louder than the sound of the grill sizzling, something inside me clicked. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear, it was a kind of tired clairvoyance, the certainty that if I let it go that time, every next time, it would be worse. Today, she comes with a piece of paper and a speech about ribs. Tomorrow, she'll come with a truck to demolish the pigsty because the pigs violate the morals of the neighborhood. And then, perhaps, with an order to paint the sky moss green because blue refers to the oppression of the capitalist solar system. people like that don't stop. They grow if you back down. And I wasn't born to back down on land that has been mine since before the HOA even had an address. But of course, I couldn't react as if I were in the Wild West either. I've seen people lose their farms for much less than a shout. So I did what any smart bumpkin does. I lowered my voice, took a deep breath, and pulled her aside, pretending I was going to talk to her like two adults. And she fell right in. She thought she'd won. She thought she had doubled another carnivorous barbarian. She accompanied me to the stables with an air of superiority, as if I were a pupil who had finally accepted the teacher's lecture. The thing is, the path to the stable runs right next to the pig's electric fence. And yes, I left that out on purpose. The woman was so drunk on her own speech that she didn't even notice when she bumped into the wire and got a shock that made her let out the most tuneful scream I've ever heard, coming from an adult throat. The shock wasn't strong enough to really hurt, just a reminder that the real world has physical limits. But the humiliation there was complete. She fell to her knees in the mud, the wet paper sticking to her blouse, and the soybean necklace flying into the grass. She stood up with a fury I've only ever seen in a cornered animal, her eyes trembling, her hand straight on the gun. And that's when I stopped playing. I took 2 steps forward and spoke very quietly, in the way that a matuto does when he's about to say something he won't forget. You're invading private property with a gun, threatening unarmed people. Your next move will define how this story ends. The woman froze. For the first time, her script had failed. There was no audience, no stage, just her, me, and the mud she fell into. The ecological heroine fantasy no longer fit that scene, and I think that, at that moment, she realized that she had gone too far. But an inflated ego is a stubborn beast. Instead of admitting that she had stepped on the wrong foot, she tried to regain her poise. She picked up the soggy paper, lifted her chin, and said she'd be back with legal reinforcement, that it wasn't over yet. And off she walked down the road, her shoes sinking into the wet earth, her legs dirty up to the knee, and a patched-up pride trying to glue the pieces of her embarrassment together. The silence after she disappeared was almost eerie. The guests were still standing around, some not knowing whether to laugh or pretend nothing had happened. My father-in-law was the first to let out a laugh. Then came my aunt, and soon the whole yard was laughing. But the funniest thing was when my nephew pointed to her necklace, still lying in the pasture, and said, "Look, Uncle, it looks like rabbit food." And that's what it was. A bunch of dyed soy balls trying to pass themselves off as planetary transformation charms. I picked it up with a twig and threw it over the fence, as if it were a broken spell. And at that moment, I knew that peace wouldn't last long, because people like that don't learn from ridicule. They learn from continuous embarrassment. So I decided that next time, I wasn't just going to wait for her to come back. I was going to be ready, because now it wasn't just about barbecue. It was about not letting an authoritarian delusion become the norm. And she would come back. There was no doubt about it. The only question was when, and with what new absurdity. But this time, it was me who was going to make the rules. It took less time than I thought. 3 days later, here she was again. Only this time, she wasn't alone. She showed up in a white pickup truck with the HOA logo all over it. Poorly adhered, by the way. And 2 uniformed guys who looked like they'd just stepped out of a public safety community theater. A black t-shirt with HOA Enforcement Division printed on the back, a matching cap, and the forced gait of someone who thinks authority comes from tactical shoes. One of them was still wearing sunglasses under the cloudy sky. I would have laughed if it hadn't been so pathetic. They stopped the car at the gate, as if they were entering a federal operation. One of the fake agents pulled out a clipboard, the other pulled out a folder full of papers with colored clips, and the woman, now wearing a gray blazer and a skirt so tight she could barely climb the ravine, got out of the back seat with the same "now it goes" look. And it did, just the wrong way again. Before they opened their mouths, I was already sitting on the balcony with my cup of coffee, watching the scene like someone watching a bad soap opera rerun. The dog was there too, this time lying on his belly, oblivious to the world, as if to say, "Again with this clowning?" She came marching up to me, the two actors behind her, and said loudly, for everyone to hear, that the HOA's Rural Sustainability Ethics Committee had deliberated on the previous carnivore aggression event and decided to apply corrective sanctions. The term she used was suspension of activities offensive to environmental well-being. That echoed through the yard like ridiculous thunder. I asked, without even changing my tone, "Is that a sentence or a slam poem?" But she didn't understand. He continued reading the paper as if it had some legal weight. It said that I was forbidden to hold any event involving meat, charcoal, smoke, or crowds with music above 40 decibels. According to her, the natural environment needed emotional recovery. The most cynical part was that she pretended to believe every syllable, as if she were doing humanity a favor. The two extras at the back were nodding their heads in sync, trying to look serious. That's when I got up and went to the shed. When I got back, I was carrying an old wooden frame in which hung the municipal zoning decree for the property. It was an official document, signed by the town mayor, stamped and registered. I handed it to her and said, "This is the only law that applies to this piece of land. If you can get a piece of paper with more weight than that, we'll talk. Until then, stop playing sheriff." She took the paper with disdain, as if she were holding a contaminated piece. But what really diffused the situation was what happened next. One of the old men from the area, Seozeka, who lives further up the hills, came riding up on his donkey, carrying a tray of cheese bread and a bottle of pinga. He said he'd heard about the previous incident and had come to reinforce the contingent resisting the lettuce dictatorship. He said it loud enough for everyone to hear, and the yard burst into laughter. Even my brother-in-law, who rarely finds anything funny, let out a whistle of approval. The woman turned red, and for the first time, she hesitated. Her commanding pose was slipping down her tight skirt. The problem is that people who live for their looks can't stand being made fun of. She turned abruptly, dropped the papers on the floor, and said that the HOA regional office would file a formal complaint against me, that it wasn't going to be cheap, that disregard for the green agenda would have consequences. And he got into the truck like someone fleeing an emotional lynching. The driver reversed so fast that he almost ran over the foot of the other guy, who was still trying to pick up the fallen clipboard. When they drove off, they left behind two staples, a plastic cup of expired soy, and a strange smell of citrus perfume with desperation. I sat down again. The coffee was still hot, and there she was again. Peace, but only on the outside, because inside, I was already planning my next move. She thought she could intimidate me with colored paper and the pose of the planet's savior, but what I was going to do now was deeper. I was going to make it so clear that this was free soil that not even the most authoritarian head could deny it. I was going to create an event, a celebration, a monument to rural freedom and the right to roast meat in your own backyard. And when she returned, because, yes, she was going to return, she would find something much bigger than a barbecue. She would find a symbolic declaration of war made with sausages, charcoal, and real people. Because in times of delirium, common sense is also a form of resistance. The invitation was spread by word of mouth, as is done here when things are really serious. No social media or flyers, because I knew that any paper lying around would end up in the wrong hands. I just said that there would be a special harvest celebration on Saturday, without going into details. And anyone who knew the tradition knew what that meant. When the people started arriving, it was after 3 in the afternoon. Some came with platters, others with guitars, others just thirsty and wanting to laugh. The smell of good smoke was already in the air, and the sound of the fire licking the grill was practically background music. This time, it wasn't just barbecue. It was cultural resistance. The ribs were turning slowly on the spit, stuck in the ground, covered in spices that my grandfather swore he had brought from Europe, even though he had never left the interior of Minas Gerais. The clothesline of little cloth flags hung from one side of the yard to the other, made from old T-shirts from agricultural fairs and dyed sackcloth. In the middle of the field, there was an improvised stage made out of stacked pallets, where the local band was already setting up. The name of the event, written with a brush on a wooden sign, said it all. Festival do Dire de Fumar Linguiça. And yes, I knew it was coming. It was as predictable as rain in October. And when she showed up, she didn't disappoint. There she was, again overdressed for the reality around her, this time in a long green dress that looked like it had been made from recycled supermarket bags. She was carrying a leather briefcase and was accompanied by a different guy from the previous ones, older, with thick glasses, looking like a retired lawyer or a frustrated accountant. I even thought that this time she had turned to someone with a degree, but her posture was the same. Nose held high, firm steps, and a "I've come to save the world" face. She didn't wait to be called. She took to the stage as if she had been invited. She took the microphone from the singer's hand without asking permission and began her speech, in a voice that sounded like it had been trained in an online public speaking course. She spoke of environmental crimes, disrespect for HOA guidelines, obsolete food practices, the impact on the local ecosystem, toxic smoke, and all this with cows mooing in the background, completely indifferent to the tragedy she was trying to paint. The people remained silent out of politeness, but it was a silence that boiled over, because there's nothing more irritating than someone wanting to control even the smell of other people's lunch. I waited for her to finish, and before her lawyer opened his mouth, I walked slowly up to the stage. With a clean cloth, I took the microphone from her hand like someone putting out a fire. I thanked them for coming, said that the community valued all forms of expression, even the most creative, and invited everyone there to give a round of applause for the theatrical representation of the collapse of modern common sense. The response was immediate. Applause, whistles, laughter, even the dog barked in rhythm. She was paralyzed, not knowing whether to respond, get down, or explode. The lawyer tried to intervene, but tripped on the step and fell sitting down, which only added to the comical effect of the situation. Before things escalated, I took an envelope out of my pocket. Inside was a letter from the city registry office, officially registering the event as a local cultural event. Yes, I had made a point of formalizing everything. Citation to the Freedom of Traditional Expression Act, recognition of the use of private space, and notification to the state's intangible heritage body. Stamp, signature, all within the law. I showed it to her, up close, not as a threat, but as a mirror, because people who live by imposition rarely look at their own limits. She left the stage without saying a word. The lawyer followed, wiping his mud-stained jacket. Their truck pulled out into the middle of the road with the sound of the festival echoing through the closed windows, and no one has heard from her since. They say she tried to file a lawsuit against me, but gave up after her own lawyer explained to her that she could, at most, be prosecuted for trespassing and armed threats. Others say that she has moved to another condominium, where she is now trying to ban the use of honey for beekeeping exploitation. What I do know is that, on that day, the farm became more than just a piece of land with a fence. It became a symbol, a trench against authoritarianism dressed up as an ecological flag. And no, I'm not against the environment. I planted a tree before it was even born. I have respect for the land, for animals, for clean water. But I also respect the freedom to live in my own way, in my own home, with my own food, my own people, and my own history. And when they try to take that away from you with a nice speech and a gun in your holster, you don't just lose the barbecue, you lose the right to be who you are. So yes, I'll keep roasting my ribs on Sundays. People keep coming. The music keeps playing. And every now and then, someone still looks down the road just to see if the figure in the green dress is going to reappear. But she never came back. Perhaps because she now understands that this isn't just a farm. It's a barricade against the absurd. And the fire is still burning. Don't forget to leave your like and comment below.